Psychology has a rich and interesting history, which would be beyond the realm of a single course, much less one lecture to cover. However, this lecture will give a very abbreviated overview of the history of psychology. We will cover the major schools of thought on psychology that have waxed and waned over the last 100+ years. We will also discuss the psychologists who were fundamental in the development and growth of each school. We will end with a short discussion of the ways that psychology is used by lay people and professionals, both within psychology and in other fields. While the roots of psychology reach back into our distant past, with philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Confucius discussing human development, interpersonal relations, values, beliefs, and other topics, the true birth of psychology as a field began with Wilhelm Wundt, a physician, physiologist, and philosopher from Germany. Wundt created a research laboratory in 1886 within the University of Leipzig. This lab was the first to be properly equipped for experimental psychology, and attracted students from around the world. While it was the first laboratory studying the new field of psychology, within a few decades, hundreds of additional laboratories had opened to study psychology. Wundt studied apperception, which is the process by which new experience is assimilated to and transformed by past experience of an individual to create a new whole. Some experimental studies completed at Wundt's lab included time sense, mental processes, and analyzing attention, associations for ideas, sensation, and memory. The primary focus for this lab was around getting exact measurement for mental timing, and additional processes such as thinking, sensation, and memory that have become a main concept for psychological research. The way that Wundt studied this was through introspection, which is an examination of one's own internal processes, such as thoughts and feelings. One of Wundt's students, Edward Titchener, expanded upon Wundt's work and developed the school of thought known as structuralism. The goal of structuralism was to figure out what the building blocks, or structure, of our inner processes are. Using introspection, researchers would break down conscious experiences into the underlying components, with the belief that doing so would allow us to develop a scientific understanding of the mind. How did this work? Looking at this painting, I want you to use introspection to record what you are thinking about. What do you think of the colors? What do you think of the theme? What does it make you feel? Now, if I looked at what you recorded and compared it to what other people's results were, do you think they would be identical? Probably not. Even if the person had the same responses to the painting you did, it is likely that they recorded them differently, using different words or reporting a different intensity of emotion. This is one of the major shortcomings with introspection, that is very subjective. Another weakness is that many of the processes that motivate our behavior occur outside of our awareness, and so we're unable to pick them up with introspection. William James, an American philosopher and psychologist, helped to found a new school of psychological thought called functionalism. James is often credited as being the father of American psychology, and made major contributions to the study of emotions and the self. James was critical of structuralism's subjectivity. However, functionalism was also interested in internal states, just as was structuralism. However, rather than focusing on the structure of our mind and consciousness, they focused on its function, or the purpose of our behaviors. James noted that introspection is difficult, since our thoughts are constantly changing, so can't be captured in time. That is, we have a stream of consciousness that is ever flowing forward. Thus, the methods of structuralists, such as introspection, he argued, were artificial and flawed. Instead, we should examine why the mind does what it does. That is, it helps us to adapt to the world around us. Another school of thought developed in opposition to structuralism, this time in Europe. This school, called Gestalt theory, argued that rather focusing on pieces of consciousness, as structuralists did, we should focus on the whole. These theorists believe that the whole is different than the sum of its parts. That is, by figuring out the structure of our consciousness, what each individual piece was, would not tell us the whole story. In fact, we'd have to see how they work together. Let's use this painting as an example. While structuralists would have you focus on the individual dots and the size and the white space and other building blocks of the painting, Gestalt theorists would say, look at the painting as a whole. What do you see when you do this? Well, in this case, you can clearly see it's a dog. It is more than just a series of different sized dots. It is more than the sum of its parts. If I'd asked you before this class to name a single psychologist, who would you name? Well, the most common response would likely be Sigmund Freud. Freud has had a major impact upon the field of psychology, as well as society generally. His ideas were revolutionary and often controversial. Freud believed that much of human behavior is determined by mental processes that occur outside of our awareness, that is, at an unconscious level. He developed psychoanalysis as a therapy to help patients to uncover these unconscious processes, to help them to come to terms and deal with these in a constructive rather than destructive manner. Many of his ideas are difficult to test scientifically. Often he relied on case studies to develop and demonstrate his theories. Case studies, as we'll see in the discussion of methodology, are in-depth studies of a single individual, which are then used to examine patterns and possible causes for behavior. However, there are methodological issues with case studies that we'll discuss in the later chapter. While many of Freud's theories are not accepted by modern psychologists, the impact he has had upon the field is undeniable, and his theory of the power of unconscious mental processes is very widely accepted by professional psychologists. During a period in which America was growing rapidly and dealing with increasingly complex social issues such as war, immigration from Europe, racial prejudice, and discrimination, John B. Watson challenged the primary focus of psychology on conscious and unconscious states, pointing out that much of the work was unscientific. He proposed that what should be studied are those things that can be directly observed, namely behaviors. This gave rise to the field of psychology known as behaviorism. Watson was influenced by the work of Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov, who you may know of through his work with dogs and the salivation reflex. If you're not familiar with his work or want a refresher, one of the videos this week is about Pavlov's dogs. Watson and later behaviorists studied how environmental stimuli influence behavior. For example, finding that animals that are rewarded with food or pleasure are more likely to engage in those behaviors that directly preceded the pleasant stimuli. Also, animals were less likely to engage in behaviors that were followed by an aversive or negative stimuli. This became known as reward and punishment, and has underlined a lot of learning theories. One of the best-known behaviorists to follow Watson was B.F. Skinner, who wrote the book Beyond Freedom and Dignity, which challenged that the concepts based on mental processes have no scientific value for explaining behavior. Behaviorism was the dominant school of psychology well into the 1960s, and is still very influential in domains such as education. Even during the height of behaviorism, there were still researchers examining mental processes, such as insight, which is the ability to problem solve without progressive learning. We have a video this week that I'd like you to check out on insight. Another mental process that was being examined at this time was observational learning, which is learning not through reward or punishment directly, but observing another person doing the behavior and being rewarded or punished. So, in the 1950s, George Miller and his colleagues started what is known as the cognitive revolution, which was a rise of research within mental processes again. And they proposed to use scientific methodology to study those mental processes, such as intelligence, thinking, decision-making, and memory, which behaviorists had previously decried as unscientific. One thing that led to this was the development of computers, which provided these cognitive psychologists with an initial model of how the mind works. Additionally, advances in various methodologies and instruments allowed cognitive psychologists to study these processes with scientific rigor that was lacking in the early 1900s, which was one of the primary reasons for Watson's critique of the field. During and after World War II, psychologists started to focus more attention on the impact of social situations on behavior. That is, the influence of other people on us. This focus on social situations was due in part to trying to explain the atrocities of the Holocaust, or how could so many normal individuals in Germany, Poland, and Austria allow, and in some cases facilitate, the murder of millions of people. Researchers began to examine the situational or social factors that impact human behaviors. For example, Kurt Lewin developed a theory of behavior that states that our behavior are due to an interaction of personal factors and social factors. Personal factors are those things we carry with us, like intelligence, personality, genetics. Social factors are those things like social norms, expectations, and authority. Kurt Lewin was the father of the school of psychology known as social psychology, which is my field. Another influential social psychologist is Gordon Allport, who did pioneering work on stereotyping and prejudice, as well as personality. So far, the researchers and theorists we have discussed have all been men. While early psychology was dominated by men, women still made enormous contributions to the field. For example, Mary Whiton Calkins wanted to study psychology with William James at Harvard University. Even though James wanted her as a student, Harvard was then an all-male university, and the university president would not allow her to enroll as a student, instead allowing her to join the seminars as a guest. Even in the face of this prejudice from the university, as well as fellow students, Calkins completed her requirements for her PhD, outscoring all her male classmates. In fact, James described it as the most brilliant examination for the PhD we have had at Harvard. However, Harvard denied her degree, offering instead one from their affiliated women's school, Radcliffe. Calkins refused the degree. Even without the doctorate, Calkins went on to make contributions to the field, publishing over 100 articles, including a number of influential studies of the self. In 1905, she was elected as the first female president of the American Psychological Association, which is the scientific and professional organization representing psychologists. Margaret Floy Washburn was the first woman to be officially granted a PhD in psychology. She earned her PhD at Cornell University in 1894, where she studied with Edward Titchener, who we discussed earlier as a pioneer in structuralism. She also became the second woman president of the APA and was a well-loved teacher at Vassar College. While the early days of psychology were largely dominated by men, the field has shifted over the last 100+ years, with women taking larger and larger roles and prominence within psychology, with women now receiving more degrees in the field than men. I can't leave this topic without discussing my graduate advisor, Bernadette Park. Bernadette is a social psychologist who's done excellent research on topics including perceptions of outgroups and social categorization, stereotyping and prejudice, memory and gender, power, gender and work, and impression formation. So women have had a huge impact on psychology, both generally and for me specifically. So far in this discussion, we've talked about professional research psychologists, or professional clinicians in the case of Sigmund Freud. However, even if you never become a psychologist doing research or seeing patients, studying psychology can provide benefits. Many fields use the results of psychological studies to inform their work. For example, psychology is useful to lawyers in selecting juries, eyewitness testimony, and jury decision-making. Managers can use psychological principles to improve workflow and performance. Physicians can use psychology to help influence their patients to engage in healthy practices and understanding social and personal barriers to health. Additionally, learning psychology is just generally useful. It helps to develop critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is the ability to think in a clear, rational, open-minded way. It is also defined by making choices based on evidence. In the modern world, we are surrounded by information as never before. We have access to the internet and social media, which bombards us with messages, often contrary ones. What should we believe, and what should we disbelieve? Using the skills and theories provided by psychology, we can start to make more rational and informed choices. We can be open, but skeptical about the messages, using rigorous processes to uncover the evidence and weigh the sources. We learn how to ask questions and where to go for information. The other introductory module has started to outline the scientific method, which is great for evaluating the world around us. The modules on methodology will expand upon this and show you how psychologists use the scientific method to be critical thinkers. This knowledge will also help you to develop this skill. So what do psychologists do? This chart breaks down the doctoral degrees issued in the psychology subfields from the 2007-2008 academic year. While the various research techniques, topics, theories, and focus of the individual psychologists within these subfields can vary, there are some similarities within the subfields. Additionally, the jobs that psychologists do vary as well, with some doing research, others doing teaching, still others seeing patients or helping to shape policy, and many other pursuits. During this course, we will talk much more in depth about the many of these various subfields, including clinical psychology, developmental psychology, personality and social psychology. In 201 Mind and the Brain, you will also learn more about neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and biological psychology. The field of psychology is vast, and it can prepare you for many different things, ranging from improving your daily life to supporting careers in other fields, to joining the field as a researcher, teacher, or clinician. This class will lay the groundwork for all of these.